Hello, welcome to the extra credits of one of the most prolific filmmakers of our time, our favorite workaholic, director Ridley Scott. I'm Trey.
And I'm Kelsi.
So in preparation for the soon-to-be-released Gladiator II, we're back talking Ridley. Are you excited as we get closer to Gladiator II? And also, are you excited to be talking about the Logan Roy of Cinema, our grandfather of this podcast in many ways?
I am, yes. Ridley Scott is one of our favorite directors. I won't defend all his choices, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. But I feel like we have been sort of, preparing for this conversation accidentally and covering almost all of his great movies. We've done Blade Runner, Alien,
Covenant, Prometheus,
we did,
Gladiator,
Napoleon, which is, it's good. It's okay. But I'm excited to kind of talk about his thematic through line today and what makes Ridley great.
It's been such a fun ride. We've certainly spent a lot of time investing in the Scott Project. We've explored his career in detail on our Napoleon deep dive last year, as you said. We talked about how different eras of his career have changed so much stylistically, thematically, emotionally. And, we've hit all the hits. And I'm just excited that he's still able to make these like $300 million epics.
Yeah.
And in lead up for Gladiator II, I was like, okay, let's do a podcast on our favorite legendary filmmaker. And the only way to do that and to do it in a unique way would to be to bring on a guest that can match our energy for Ridley Scott. Someone who is one of our favorite voices in the movie space, and a guest we had on to talk about one of our favorite directors, Damien Chazelle, just last year, which was a ton of fun. And that person is, of course, Sean Fennessey. Sean, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Ridley Scott.
What's up, Trey and Kelsi? I'm glad to know that I'm not the grandfather of this podcast, that there's an elder who is older than me who can come and represent something meaningful. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about his movies. I love Ridley.
Yeah, I loved what you, Amanda Dobbins, and Chris Ryan did last year, the fantastic Ridley Scott Hall of Fame episode for the release of Napoleon. I thought that was really educational. As people who love Ridley Scott, it was just a ton of fun to listen to, just people going through his different eras of his career. And you posed a question on that episode about whether or not Ridley Scott has made a masterpiece in every decade since the 70s. And I'd love to explore that today. I think that would be fun as just a question of this whole episode and going through his work. And I do think we're super biased, but I do think he has delivered a classic or debatable classic in each of the past 5 decades. And your question really got me thinking, and Kelsi and I thinking, and we've been talking for for months now in preparation for this conversation about how he's had some movies celebrated during their time. He's had other movies reclaimed. And he could have future films in his 90s. He could have, masterpieces on their way. We don't know.
Yeah.
Apparently he's got like 4 movies in production right now. That's just Ridley Scott. And so I guess I was thinking about, okay, well then who are some of the living directors, maybe of New Hollywood, that have had a great movie each decade? Because you have the Coppolas, you have the Malicks, Eastwood, De Palmas, the kind of last remnants of New Hollywood. But then I really narrowed it down with Kels, and we were thinking of really Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg as the two big names of people who have spoken to so many generations. So I know it's very subjective, but it's really my first question for you and for something for us to discuss. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you think Ridley Scott belongs in that same tier of film history as Scorsese and Spielberg, these juggernauts of cinema over the past 50 years? Or has he somehow jeopardized his status in film history with, he risks the quality of his movies by being so prolific in a lot of ways, and he's so flippant.
He's just putting out so much.
Yeah, putting out a lot, and he's also flippant in the media. He's very reductionist of his critics, and he has been referred to as the style over substance, ad man for hire. So do you think he's in that conversation, or is he somewhere else?
I think at the top of his game, his work stands very comfortably with those other filmmakers, but I think for all the reasons that you just outlined, there is a kind of commerciality to everything that he does that I think is ultimately not respected. I think he's also not a writer-director, and he's a director whose themes are sometimes more subterranean, like what interests him, or maybe just inconsistent. And so because of that, it's a lot harder to project meaning onto his career beyond the commercial the same way you can for someone like Scorsese, who represents this very kind of East Coast underdog conception of progress in America or lack thereof, or someone like Spielberg who kind of imports like childlike wonder and angst into the American experience in the 70s and 80s. With Ridley, it's like, so he's like kind of an angry commercial director from England. Yeah. And he thinks very mechanically about his productions, and he's inspired by great art, but tends to shoot it through the lens of a system and thinks specifically about the way that systems work, and sometimes is skeptical of them and sometimes celebrates them. And you never really know, sometimes it's a Weyland-Yutani and sometimes it's an American gangster. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that inconsistency kind of keeps him in, I guess, like 1B. You just named maybe the two most significant American filmmakers of the last 50 years. And he's not quite on that level, but Alien and Blade Runner and Gladiator and, maybe a handful of other films are up there with the best films from those filmmakers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he has had a career of like almost 30 films now in 50 or so years. And I think that's a lot considering he started really directing movies, I think at the age of 40, around there. And, he's made 8 or 9 pretty bad to terrible movies. And then I'd say he's probably made like 15 or so, which is a lot, solidly good films that I think they're all on a spectrum of really good to just fine. And then I think he's made like the ones you outlined, like 5 or 6 universally recognized great films across all genres, depending on who you ask. I do think that is an impressive hit rate, more than most people seem to give him credit for. But I think that's because every generation of moviegoers over the past 5 decades has experienced a great Ridley Scott movie and a bad Ridley Scott movie. His work feels a little bit diluted for that reason. And as far as Ridley Scott films themselves and what they convey thematically and emotionally, I think audiences have found, Scorsese and Spielberg just to be more consistent, like Sean's saying. They are playing with different ideas, sort of. Like Scorsese's obviously got his introspective, cautionary tales about power and greed and the consequences of violence through the lens of the American dream. And Spielberg is doing all kinds of things with moral dilemmas throughout his historical epics like Private Ryan and Schindler's List. And he's really like known for his sentimental coming of age adventures. But those filmmakers really focus on character studies. So I was trying to feel like, okay, what is it here about Ridley Scott that isn't maybe as respected as those two legends, and keeps him at 1B. And I agree that it's the inconsistencies, but I also think it's something, Kelsi, you've brought up on multiple episodes over the past few months of doing, Covenant and Prometheus deep dives before Romulus, which is that Scott is more focused on concepts than characters. And that does hold him back a little bit sometimes.
Yeah.
What makes his movies great.
Yeah. I mean, I think also like Sean's saying too, he is focused on systems. And so he talks a lot about how he really looks for scripts, because he's not a writer director, but he looks for scripts with great characters and complex characters. But then he also has this kind of interesting contrast of this really epic scale backdrop with these complex, interesting characters in there. It feels kind of like a tonal clash. I think of something like Napoleon, where you have you're exposing the fragility of this historical figure with this massive epic that people feel like they're going to see Braveheart, but they're actually seeing a movie where it's making fun of Napoleon.
Closer to Barry Lyndon.
But I do think that while Scorsese and Spielberg are way more consistent, and I obviously love their movies, I really appreciate Scott because of his kind of brutal way of looking at those characters that he picks. And in that way, I don't know that I agree with all of the way that he looks at the world. There are some politically confusing things, especially when we get to his military movies.
Same with Tony.
Yeah. But I do think that his kind of brutalness and the way that he addresses characters, and especially men's egos, with a Weyland or with a Napoleon, or you can even think of Holloway, right? Thinking about how he's going to make history in Prometheus. I'm more fascinated in that because it's more of a sociological lens of the characters.
Right.
Versus, Scorsese and Spielberg, while I, again, really appreciate their movies, there does seem to be more of a sentimental, I think, like, storytelling point of view for some of the characters, which is fine.
Definitely Spielberg. I would say Scorsese, the problem there has always been, okay, where does the sympathy start? Where does the critique begin? And kind of figuring that nuance out. And he's certainly had movies that have been misinterpreted throughout his eras of filmmaking, like Wolf of Wall Street, really famously for our generation. Yeah, I mean, I also loved what Sean said about the how he's not a writer. He's a visual artist, somebody who has a tendency to prioritize like atmosphere and concept, like we're saying, over character, which has led him to be boxed in different ways. But I just thought that would be an interesting way to start the conversation, just like him, thinking about him in the history of cinema, because the two biggest blockbuster spectacle filmmakers right now, I think, are Denis Villeneuve and Christopher Nolan. I mean, Sean, do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that, like, that combination of artistry and grandeur and also making crowd-pleasing spectacle,
Yeah.
And obviously Ridley is very much in that mold, and those two are pretty meaningfully inspired by him.
Yeah, those guys seem to be the two. Like, when Ridley leaves us one day, those two seem to be the one filling the mantle, and they're the ones who are most clear about it. I mean, they speak about Kubrick a lot, or Bergman, when they talk about the more kind of art house sensibilities of their films. But when they're talking about the bigger picture of their movies, they're really bringing up Kubrick and Ridley Scott a lot, which is fascinating. I mean, Denis Villeneuve is like truly looking at the Scott playbook, being like, how can I make Dune? I want to make a sequel to Blade Runner 2049, which apparently almost broke him, which we saw in the news recently, which I'm sympathetic to. I'm sure that was a lot. But yeah, I guess it's just interesting to look at the current landscape of films and to look at, okay, who is Ridley Scott inspiring? Because so many great indie filmmakers have said they're inspired by, Martin Scorsese or Spike Lee, and our blockbuster filmmakers seem pretty like it's either like Spielberg or Ridley Scott. It really feels like that's the one and two. And I've always thought of them together. I've always viewed Spielberg as the nice guy, and even though he's had his like obviously like harrowing movies, but as the more adventurous, soulful person. And I've looked at Ridley Scott as this like nihilist, maybe more cynic, but bordering on nihilism kind of director.
A little bit more gritty. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But I think those two are kind of in their own tier.
I think also, I mean, Ridley only makes movies for adults. He doesn't really make movies for all audiences. All of his films have adult themes. They're often very violent. They are, I think that cynicism is right, but I think there's also kind of like a frankness to the worlds, even if they're fantastical worlds, that you don't find in every Spielberg movie or even necessarily in every Scorsese movie. Like, Ridley Scott does not have a Hugo in his career.
Mm-hmm.
He barely has a Catch Me If You Can in his career. Maybe you could say Matchstick Men kind of fills that gap, but most of his movies, especially in the last 15, 20 years, I mean, these are all movies for grown-ups, often rooted in history or in kind of a future history in terms of the Alien movies that are about the consequences of hard-bitten decisions. That seems to be something that he is really interested in, and wealth, power, and how it filters down into the world. And so I think these movies are really fun, but I don't think most people think they're really fun. I think that they're actually meant to feel like important and maybe not deep, but impactful. So, he's just regarded very differently, even though, he went to the Royal College of Art and is a real aesthete and a real designer of ideas and visionary worlds. Like, he's a money guy, like I say that with respect. Like, he's interested in success.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he has like that huge commercial background. He did advertising for so long. I think that's probably where a lot of his anger comes from in the media when we see him in interviews or telling historians to shut the fuck up about Gladiator, or Napoleon. He certainly has an edge to him because of his upbringing, I think. And there was a great piece in the New Yorker last year or a year or two ago now that breaks down his career that I recommend people check out. Okay, so let's go back to that original question of the episode and maybe think about, okay, has he made a great movie every decade of since the 1970s? Because I do think that is an interesting conversation. I do think it identifies or locates something about longevity in this industry that really, I think, is a good way to create a rubric around whether or not someone truly is a master filmmaker, if you will. If we're going to like think about auteur theory in this way, like somebody who's really kind of continue to make movies at a high rate, at a big scale, or however they want to make their movies. Like he has a $300 million Gladiator sequel coming out that nobody asked for, and he's 87 in a few weeks. So like that, there's just not many people who can get something like that made. Or Killers of the Flower Moon with Apple Plus last year, $200 million or so movie. Like, it's wild that these filmmakers are able to get these kinds of budgets, but it is something that I think as audiences, it excites us because it makes us feel like there are still these individuals who have some kind of control over the studio system.
Yeah, I think to answer your question, I mean, I think he pretty definitively has if not a masterpiece, like a great film in every decade. And I think that's one of the reasons why he keeps getting the budget, because it's like, maybe he'll make The Martian, maybe he'll make Blade Runner. You never know with him. If he's locked in and he's got the right material, he's somebody who really rises and falls relative to the material in front of him. And with a great script, he often makes a great movie. But one thing that's interesting about that arc that you're talking about across 6 decades at this point, is the masterpieces are often followed by pretty significant fallow periods.
Yeah.
Like if you look at Alien and then the aftermath, or if you look at the Alien and Blade Runner, twin hit across 3 years, and then you go into a period where it's Legend, Someone to Watch Over Me, and Black Rain.
Yeah.
These are not 3 of his most beloved movies. Then he recovers, so to speak, with Thelma and Louise, which is a kind of quintessential 90s movie, a totally unexpected kind of film for him. And then he goes into a period where he makes 1492, White Squall, and G.I. Jane. And then the 90s are basically shot for him after that. And then he makes Gladiator, but he follows Gladiator up with Hannibal. Not so good, even though it was successful. Black Hawk Down, good. Matchstick Men, kind of a disappointment. Kingdom of Heaven, kind of a fiasco. A good year, a total fiasco. American Gangster, solid, but maybe underwhelming. Like, he toggles back and forth between, wow, Ridley is back, to... man, what happened to Ridley? Pretty consistently.
Yeah. No. Yeah. That kind of, I think, that volatility in his career is kind of what you said at the top. I mean, that inconsistency is what maybe keeps audiences away from being like, I have a connection to this director, as if he's Spielberg or Scorsese. And also, Kelsi, you mentioned something the other day about how it's hard to identify a Ridley Scott movie sometimes because he's played in so many different genres across different eras. And that does leave a little bit of kind of are you a gun for hire? It is what it feels like sometimes when he is making certain movies. But I was trying to find like, okay, I certainly think there's a thematic through line in his work. And I think, Sean, you already mentioned that and you located that pretty quickly. I think in terms of like the cinematic hallmarks of his work, I think most people attribute some kind of like textured atmosphere that feels a little bit risky to his work. And it could be something very obvious in a dystopian like world, like the rainy streets of Blade Runner, or it could be something in this claustrophobic machinery like the Nostromo, or it could be something that is more like grand and simultaneously foreboding in Thelma and Louise as you're watching these two women go through this open Western landscape. And I think that the subtext of those environments really speak to the ideas he's trying to get across in his movies, which is constantly about like people navigating the world through obstacles, through constructs, usually like masculinity somehow. And that's something he continuously comes back to. And that's why he tends to try to put complex woman characters in his stories. And I do think once you identify there's a movie with that, I think that is the one that I think speaks to more audiences, and therefore that is the one that could live on as something that is more classic or great, or overusing it, but masterpiece. So I think Sean mentioned a bunch, but let's just do it real quick. Let's just see what this is like. 1970s, we have Alien, which is my favorite movie of all time, maybe the most influential movie of the modern era. 1980s, we have Blade Runner. The 1990s, we have Thelma and Louise, which has been reclaimed, I think, over the past 15 years as a real classic. 2000s, we have Gladiator. And I'm just going to say those 4 are pretty, like, I think they're in there, right? If you're going to say like,
Yeah.
which ones are the classic Scott movies, the ones that will live on, I think those four, if we're going to identify something as masterpieces through different decades, that would be the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Now, I know some Ridley Scott people listening or watching are probably thinking, what about American Gangster? What about Kingdom of Heaven? I'm sure the Kingdom of Heaven heads are feeling disrespected. Those are good films in their own right. I think American Gangster, watching Denzel kind of have his not quite Goodfellas-esque movie, but it feels like I'm watching something that would be a fascinating like Godfather level trilogy, or the beginning to something, and it's all squeezed into one film, as often Ridley Scott movies are. And then Kingdom of Heaven, if you've seen the director's cut, then you know it's quite the immersive experience. And I think if you sit down and watch the whole thing, you know it's there's nothing quite like it, or it's in that kind of rarefied tier of like a David Lean movie or something like that, a massive epic that it will live on. But I think those four, Alien, Blade Runner, Thelma and Louise, Gladiator, are the cemented ones. The one that's more complicated, and the one I want to ask you about, Sean, because I've heard you mention this film, a couple of these films, a few times on The Big Picture. In the 2010s, he is a very complicated decade. It's arguably the most volatile decade of his career in as far as him making great movie, bad movie. Also, Tony Scott, his brother, passed away, one of the great action directors of the last 30 years. And I think looking back at this decade, even though it's his most volatile, I think you could argue the 2010s is his most impressive decade of filmmaking, because he has his most divisive films, but they have really high highs. Like we have Prometheus, we have The Counselor, we have Covenant, we have The Martian. There's a lot. Like the first 75 minutes of Covenant rule. Like nothing, like in terms of horror in the 21st century, there's nothing quite close to that. Like in fact, the Fede Alvarez Alien Romulus film that maybe we can talk about later today, I was hoping it would touch like what Covenant had in that first 75 minutes, because it's Alvarez, Evil Dead, and all the other films, Don't Breathe, that he's made so wonderfully in terms of the horror space. But Covenant, God, the first hour, it's intense.
Yeah. That the spaceship whole opening scene is like pretty wild. But I mean, so do you want to like talk about Prometheus and Covenant as kind of reclaimed projects?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to? Yeah. I mean, so I don't know, Sean, I don't know if you noticed this online. I don't know how online you've been recently, but Prometheus has been reclaimed in the past month or so. Because
reclaimed from whom? I was there when it came out, and I loved it the day it was released. I've talked about this on The Big Picture before, but I have a very vivid memory of seeing that movie. I saw it the Saturday of its opening weekend. The day before that was a Grantland Christmas party at Bill Simmons' home, and we had a lot of fun that night. That was when I was a much younger person, and me, Chris Ryan, and Andy Greenwald went to go see Prometheus together at the ArcLight Cinerama Dome, which is sadly now shuttered. And I can speak at least for Chris and I, maybe less so for Andy, who was just a little bit hungover, that we were rocking out, man. We were like crying in the aisles. We were like, this is it. This is the kind of like incredibly bold, maybe not 100% successful, but imaginative, fearless science fiction storytelling, and basically like legacy sequel, prequel creativity that I feel like is still really missing from most contemporary movies. And I loved The Swing. I love how that movie looks. I love the performance style. I love the scare set pieces. Most of the performances I love. I have a little bit of a Noomi Rapace allergy, so that performance didn't totally work for me. But aside from that, I really love what that movie is up to, and it's been interesting to watch that movie and Covenant, another movie that I liked a lot upon release, and even like it even more now, get sort of like filtered through what are actually the good Alien movies? And you think about like what an Alien movie should be or could be, and of course, Ridley has an incredible handle on it, and he's had 3 bites at the apple, so he's had 3 chances to do something different each time, and I think he did do something different each time. But I do and have always ridden for both of those sequel prequels.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Prometheus was something at the beginning of our friendship and relationship. We were like, do you love Prometheus? Like, I like it's something that I find people like have starts of friendships over, or they feel like a bond if someone else loved Prometheus.
Or it's
a secret handshake movie. Yeah. It's like a secret handshake. Yeah, where you're like, oh my God, we're the same. Yeah, it's how you build a bond for sure.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's been interesting to have Prometheus, I think, like, embraced as the Alvarez Romulus comes out, because I think I had like a reaction that I wasn't expecting. I'm not really into sports, but I had kind of a reaction of my team now is like a bandwagon team, which is something that I've never experienced before in my life. Like, I was like, I've stuck with this movie for all the losing seasons. But I realized that the reason I like even felt that way was because I want more alien movies that are focusing on what Ridley Scott kind of explores in his alien movies, which is that like you were saying before with Blade Runner and the Whalen Corporation, or Tyrell, but in Alien, right, the monster is the company. Right. And in Prometheus, the monster is the company, but then more so specifically looking at like the ego of the person in charge of that company attached to it.
Yeah.
Where, I liked Alien Romulus, but it felt more so like a monster movie that had really cool set pieces. And I wanted to see a little bit more of the capitalism that was like at the core of Ridley's versions. And I felt like we didn't really get that explored because Prometheus wasn't as accepted before.
Yeah. I feel that not only the kind of like anti-colonialist, anti-capitalist through line of Prometheus and Covenant, but the parallel of Wayland and Shaw's character, this kind of person trying to fight for immortality through corporations, and another person trying to fight for more significance in their life through God. That was like really fascinating, and felt like Ridley's most vulnerable attempt at that through line, because he's done that a lot. He's like, we're going to explore why people are stunted by the search for trying to immortalize themselves. And people have tried that through decades, he's been trying to do that through decades as like this real problem that stunts us as a human race through all eras of society. And I think that's really commendable. And then because those ideas are so ambitious, half of his filmography kind of feels stupid, because that's such a, like hit blunt once kind of conversation. But the other half of his movies that are attempting to interrogate that then feel kind of like they're breaking norms and conventions and standards in the industry, and allowing for, as Sean was saying, like, if we're going to live in this era where franchises are just dominating theaters and distribution of movies, then let's use IP and let's manipulate the shit out of it and turn it into weird, strange, bizarre epics like, Prometheus or Covenant.
One other thing about that's really interesting about the Alien movies is, for the most part, that franchise is the domain of what we call auteurs, and especially writer-directors like Jim Cameron. Fede Alvarez is an auteur. He's a co-writer on this new movie. And when you are a writer-director, there can sometimes be some limitations. And I think what Ridley is after in the franchise is an extension, an extrapolation of what the movies can represent every time around. So when you look at who's writing these screenplays, Dan O'Bannon coming up with significant aspects of the script and the character, and looking at Walter Hill's contributions, and then in Prometheus, the idea of combining Damon Lindelof and John Spates' vision, getting someone like John Logan, a celebrated screenwriter who I think did he write Gladiator, John Logan? I think he did.
Yes.
To do a pass on on Covenant. Like, he is using this kind of best idea wins model for building out these IP brands in a way that a lot of other filmmakers in this realm don't really do that. What David Fincher went through with Alien 3 is obviously well chronicled, and there were many different ideas for that film. But for the most part, most directors have not worked the way that Ridley is working on these movies. And you get the impression that he's the kind of person who's kind of like pushing for what he thinks is best across periods of time, and has enough power and influence to get what he wants out of these projects.
Yes, absolutely. Well, then that leads me to, I think, another question, if we're going to stay in the Alien universe, because it is pretty cool that Ridley Scott has created an informal universe. You know, he has his own production company with Scott Free Productions. He has created his own TV show that feels like it's in the Alien universe. I'm forgetting what that's called, the Android TV show on Max. But
Raised by Wolves.
Thank you. Yes, Raised by Wolves. And, you know, he's confirmed, and I think there are many images that confirm the crossover of the universe of Blade Runner and Alien. So it's pretty sick that he was like inspired by Star Wars to try to be like, I can do that shit in my sleep and I'm going to make it for adults, even though I love Star Wars. Yeah. So like there are just not many directors who are looking to grab studio capital and twist it in that way. So I was going to ask you, as somebody who, I figured you were on the Prometheus Covenant Hive, or you were in it, as somebody who loves those films like we do, are you hoping that this Alien universe, now that Disney owns 20th Century Studios, are you hoping that this, you know, Alien Cinematic Universe continues to find new life, like the original Alien quadrilogy, where we had Ridley Scott, James Cameron, David Fincher, and now we have Fede Alvarez, directing Romulus, which just did incredible numbers. Basically is going to 2x what Joker 2 did on Joker 2 with a much larger budget, which is wild. And people just love horror right now. I think you had a good tweet thread about this earlier this week about independent horror right now just blowing up this year. But Alien Romulus specifically being this like obvious like fan servicey movie, though it still attached this director Fede Alvarez, who is able to kind of give it his own twist. Is that the direction you want to see Disney take the Alien IP, or are you hoping that we get to see Michael Fassbender dressed up as David now that he's done racing cars and we can kind of see him back in his psycho mode?
I mean, why not both, right? I think we can have both. Sure. If Ridley wants to make another Alien movie and he can convince them to do it, that'd be wonderful. You know, there is about to be this Noah Hawley Alien TV series as well. So I think that complicates what the expectations are of the franchise. If I were 20th Century Studios, I would probably every 3.5 years to 5 years do what they did with Romulus. I would just find another filmmaker who's got a handle and a take that knows how to make, you know, a scare fest that also has some deeper ideas in it. Find an interesting cast. You know, this was the first time really that young people were at the center of a Romulus movie. I thought that was one of the smart kind of additions and expansions to the franchise, that it became much more about like, it was kind of like the Zoomer version of an Alien movie, not like the craggy blue collar version of the original, or the sort of over intellectualized scientists of Covenant who have no idea what's coming for them. So I think you could have everything. It's just such a fungible, great series that has one of the ultimate creature effects in movie history. And so there's a lot of different things they can do with it. I don't think we need to pair him back up with the Predator anytime soon. That doesn't seem like something we need to see any more of. But yeah, you know, should 90-year-old Ridley Scott make another Alien movie? I mean, I'm not going to say no. You know?
That was like, awesome. Yeah,
he was like 80 years old when he made Covenant, and that movie's fucking incredible. So, or at least just extraordinary in what it accomplishes, even if the script is imperfect, in my opinion. So, yeah, sure. I mean, yes to everything, right? Like, I'm not going to complain about any Alien storytelling.
It's just my dream to see David again. He's one of my favorite
I
fictional
miss
characters.
Fassbender too.
Yeah.
It's just, I mean, after The Killer, I got so excited. And hearing that David Fincher was inspired to cast Michael Fassbender because he loved him in Prometheus makes me happy. It makes my heart warm, because obviously Alien 3, like you mentioned, just was a horrible production and he's like disowned that movie. But to know that he sat in a theater watching Prometheus just like Sean, maybe hungover and just kind of like we did probably, and then was like, this guy, I need to get him in The Killer. So I think the next movie that I want to discuss is Gladiator II. So I think we've established maybe the different eras of Ridley Scott. We had the 70s, we had the 80s with the 90s. So we had Alien, Blade Runner, Thelma and Louise. We talked about Gladiator. We talked about Prometheus and the ACU, the Alien Cinematic Universe. I'm going to say that Prometheus is probably his 2010s, like the movie that will live on as this sci-fi space classic, because I'm not sure that... because that movie was actually very successful. I think it did a lot to even get like something like Dune funded, to be honest. And the kind of success of that movie, and especially with the fear around Blade Runner 2049 struggling so much, Prometheus was looked at a lot as, even though it was a divisive film for audiences, it made a ton of money, and people forget about that. But another couple of movies that came out that decade, we had the United States and China coming together to spend billions of dollars to save Matt Damon off Mars in The Martian, So we watched The Martian a couple weeks ago, and Sean, I don't know if you've seen it recently, but you really cannot tell, outside of maybe the color grading that has this like kind of gray, blue, septic looking colors that is in Ridley Scott movies like Black Hawk Down or whatever. But The Martian does not feel like a Ridley Scott film, like at all. It feels like his name is on there, like to sell movie tickets. Like I can't.
It feels like a very sanitized, character exploration compared to his other movies.
Yeah,
yeah. We did a Rewatchables episode about it. I want to say maybe 4 years ago in COVID, and that was a good movie to look at that time because it's very much a movie about isolation and hopelessness. At least for the first stretch of the film. I really like The Martian. I think it is a traditional crowd pleaser, and obviously that's not really something Ridley Scott does very often. He makes much more hopeless movies. I think it's just a function of the script. I just think that the Drew Goddard adaptation of the novel is very zippy and very fun, and has a lot of jokes, and has some some of the casting is very unusual. Donald Glover and Kristen Wiig and these sort of actors that we're not used to seeing in Ridley Scott movies, who often casts purely dramatic theatrical actors in his work. Yeah. And so because of that, it feels different, but I think it's a damn good Matt Damon performance at the center of it. I think there is a kind of emotional interest in problem solving that does feel true to his spirit, that there is something, like a lot of his characters are often detectives or characters trying to get to the bottom of something, figure out why some wrong has been committed. So It feels in keeping with that. It's just the spirit is just very peppy for.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of smiling in the movie, even though it's about a marooned astronaut.
Yeah.
And that's obviously just not something we see in his dark and grainy and rain-covered films.
Right. And it's also like Matt Damon, at the center of that too.
The everyman.
I think though it's interesting because a lot of people who love The Martian also really love Gladiator. And like I love Gladiator, but I think that it is a kind of crowd pleaser. And so I'm really interested to see what happens in Gladiator II. Because I think Ridley is like interested in the Joaquin Phoenix Commodus, where he was interested in Napoleon. And I think people were going to Napoleon expecting, especially it was like a Thanksgiving screening I think we went into. There were a lot of families. People were expecting a kind of gladiator, right, epic, and then got Napoleon making fun of like the fragility of this man and glorifying figures in history. And so I'm interested to see what he does in Gladiator 2.
Yeah, well, I don't think he's going to go too campy, but he is going to get strange with the emperors, right? He is constantly making critiques or poking fun at powerful people who do not deserve their power. And like that is something he is obsessed with. And as far as him being a red button pusher, if you will, not unlike Christopher Nolan or Denis Villeneuve about certain like maybe having sometimes contradictory politics, though very bold aspirations of what they're trying to interrogate or examine. Ridley Scott loves to make fun of like wealthy, corrupt men. Like that is like his that's his shtick, and it's awesome. It's a lot of fun, but I think with Gladiator, based off the trailers, it looks like we're just going to get a really good ass time. Like I think Denzel and Paul Mescal are going to light up the screen. I'm hoping that it's secretly a Denzel Washington movie, and just like we have the Paul Mescal emotional journey, but we're going to walk out of it being like, that was Denzel in a Gladiator epic. That'd be sick.
Yeah, that's
what the hope is, at least.
I am seeing it on Friday, guys, so I'm very excited.
Wow, dang.
Yeah.
Oh, man, enjoy yourself. Wow.
Yeah. Apparently the whole cast and crew are going to be there for a Q&A.
Whoa.
Oh, wow.
Very, very, very excited.
Wow. Are you going to throw on Gladiator the night before? Prepare yourself?
I think I have to, right?
Yeah.
I think I had just a prep. I honestly haven't seen Gladiator in a very long time. And it is a movie that I always liked and never loved, even though it has some high points. There's something just like, kind of to your point, Trey, about The Martian. There's something very classical about it, and I don't think of that as Ridley's style. I guess in 1492 he's going for some of that too, this sort of like epic historical grandeur. I think of his movies as kind of inversions of those ideas, like The Duelist is an inversion of those ideas, Legend is an inversion of those ideas of like our expectations of a certain kind of a genre movie. Obviously Blade Runner and Alien are totally inverting Star Wars in 2001 into this like much more cracked, claustrophobic, scary setting. Gladiator always just felt like a movie about a triumphant warrior, and we've seen a lot of movies like that over the 120 years of movies. Like that's a very common theme. It's a great version of this common idea. But I'm looking forward to going back to it and seeing how I feel about it because it's been a long time since I've seen it.
I think the thing to look out for on this rewatch will be what Joaquin Phoenix is up to. Like, you can tell when you first watch it, but watching it again after having all these years with Phoenix and all this history built in, the James Gray films or the PTA work, or now like him as the Joker, like seeing him kind of crawl around in this slimy way throughout this movie on rewatch was just so compelling. And he was just so theatrical. Incredible stuff.
I love when he says I'm vexed.
Yeah, terribly vexed. Yeah, he's so good in it. Man, I'm really excited for you. I'm deeply jealous.
But I am interested to see, I think, like if he does keep that kind of Gladiator, I guess a more traditional pacing and crowd pleasing kind of angle for the second one. I know he'll get all his things. I know he wanted like a rhino right in the first one. I think he's going to get that here, but
he's gonna flood the Coliseum.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what he does with like Connie Nielsen's character and obviously the Mescal character connection. Yeah.
Russell Crowe will pop up in the afterlife maybe. I think that going back to the campiness, let's talk about the satires of his career because it's something that I think confuses a lot of people, and I don't think it's just media literacy. I don't think it's just like audiences don't know how to like totally sit with his movies. Maybe sometimes it is that, but I think it's like tonally Ridley Scott can be there's too much movie in his movies sometimes, right? There's too many different styles going on, and he has, The Counselor, or he has House of Gucci, or Napoleon, or honestly, even though it takes itself more seriously because it's the 90s, but Demi Moore and like G.I. Jane and what that movie does with its humor is kind of interesting, but even though it's a very serious story, like he does kind of look for ways to poke fun at very masculine figures or families, wealthy families, and then find a woman in peril in one of those situations. And that's true with House of Gucci and Napoleon, sort of in The Counselor, and then definitely like something like G.I. Jane, but I can't think of another one pre the 2000s. But what satire do you think works for you, Sean? Are you a Counselor guy? Are you a House of Gucci person?
100%. Okay. Yeah, no, I'm a huge Cormac McCarthy fan. I think, that one's complicated because he picked it up from his brother. And that movie, it's not just that the kind of storytelling is much more like his brother, but the tonality of it, this sort of like wry, melodramatic, humorous, but not winking storytelling style is just not very Ridley, in my opinion. And it feels like much more of an active homage to his late brother and much more of an homage to McCarthy's writing style. Like it's clearly written by McCarthy because it's elliptical and philosophical and very gruesome at times, but also like rooted in a kind of spirituality in the natural world that recurs in all of his work. So like none of those things are really appear in many Ridley Scott movies. That's not really something he's terribly interested in. So it's a real outlier, but I think it's a really fun and funny movie. And if the first time you see it, it's very shocking because, the humping the car and the bolito, cutting someone's head off and all the intense stuff that you see. And then the second time you see it, it's a lot easier to kind of see it for what it is, which is a very, very sad movie about like trying to reconstitute something that you've lost. That's really, it's not just an homage, it's an attempt to kind of like revive his brother's aesthetic and ethic. And I think it's successful.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of shocking, images or sequences in that film. So I think you're right on. The first time I watched it, I was really thrown off. The second time I watched it, had a good time, and really no notes for what it's trying to do and what it's trying to be. But it is hard to like tackle that true romance energy that Ridley Scott really isn't comfortable in. Though I will say there is something about House of Gucci that is really impressive. I'm not prepared to like totally explore why Ridley Scott, the British filmmaker, is poking fun at like Italians or the French or Europeans at large. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe our listeners can let us know, but like it is fascinating that he's been doing this over his last years making movies. I think it's such an interesting experiment.
Yeah, this is kind of a flippant response to the years and years that go into making a film, but it kind of feels like he doesn't give a fuck sometimes. Yeah. And the I'm not thinking that hard about what I'm doing. I'm just doing it because I have the power to go forward.
Yes.
It feels like there's less intentionality in the work now. There's just sort of I'm interested in this, I'm going to go.
Yeah.
And I think that's normal when you are nearing the end of your life, where you're like, I'm not done creating. I don't have years and years to stew over whether or not a movie is a good idea or not. I've had an emotional impulse. And yes, all the money in the world. Yes, The Last Duel. Yes, House of Gucci. Yes, Napoleon. And all of those movies, I have liked all of those movies, even though all of them are uneven to some extent.
Yes.
Because I think he has kind of a baseline of craft and a baseline of characterization where he lets actors take chances that I always find entertaining. And they're not in the class of the, masterpieces that we're talking about earlier. They're really not even in the class of the Black Hawk Down or even American Gangster, where you're there's some really incredible skill on display here. They're a step below those movies.
Yeah.
But I'm never upset that I saw them. I'm never well, fuck, that was a waste of my time,
Yeah. No, it's really true. I think in Napoleon, though, every time we laughed, nobody in the audience was laughing. So again, I think it comes back to
I had a very similar experience. Yeah.
I don't know what's accessible. And I think, was it PTA that maybe did rewrites on Napoleon? Is that what the rumor was?
That was reported. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, I don't know.
But you could kind of feel there was some Phantom Thread energy. Kelsi, I think you mentioned that on our episode.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's because Ridley just puts out so much. I feel like people get confused on what tone they're going into with his movie because most people do see the hits, the alien, the kind of serious or the more commercial epic of Gladiator. And then when they go into something like House of Gucci, they're like, what is this? And then they get confused, especially with Napoleon too. I think it's fascinating. And it is kind of, Sean, what you're saying. He is one of my favorite people to watch, give interviews to. I don't know if you all have seen or listened to the Mark Maron interview that he gave. And it's just an hour of him basically being his biggest supporter. He doesn't even need a PR team, essentially. He just every time he spoke, he was like, have you seen this movie? And it was his movie. And he said it was the best movie or it was phenomenal. Yeah. So his confidence to Sean, you're saying, just tackle any project and not really have a Thelma Schoonmaker to help him with the pacing. I feel like he needs someone to tell him maybe no sometimes with the pacing of his movies of what should maybe be included. But like you said, Sean and Trey, we feel this way. I'm never upset that I saw it. I always have a good time. And I think also, though, some of that has to do with me loving Ridley's filmography and knowing kind of where humor comes from or kind of understanding a little bit of what he's trying to do with the story. Yes. So I think some of it comes from that. I don't know if I would enjoy them just as a regular movie goer.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then I think what I'm thinking is 1970s Alien, 1980s Blade Runner, 1990s Thelma and Louise, 2000s Gladiator, 2010s Prometheus, Counselor, different vibes for different people. And then 2020s, none of them. The only question I had, I guess, about the 2020s is how great would The Last Duel be if it came out today and not during the pandemic? Would that really hit if it didn't have the pandemic hurting it? Because it isn't a movie that felt like anybody's ever asking for, especially with that subject matter. It's very challenging. But the performances in that film, the way it's edited, the way it's structured, the narrative, the screenplay, I think Nicole Holofcener came on that one. It is, we just rewatched it a few weeks ago. A really excellent film, and that duel at the end, it made me reassess, okay, when I saw this in theaters, I was like, that's good. But also I couldn't tell if a lot of those 2021 films, I can't tell how much of those, that was just pretty good versus that could have been great if it was just a different, era, a different time that it came out in. But that one feels sort of timeless.
It feels like the most complete when we're comparing it to some of his other messier projects.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's his best overall film since The Martian. I think The Covenant has higher highs, but is a little bit murkier in the second half. I don't know if there's ever a time when it would have been like more well received or more celebrated. It's an interesting question. I remember when it came out. I remember when I saw it, which was way ahead of release, and a very small screening room with a very small number of people. And I was kind of looking around like, wow, this is a really excellently conceived historical drama. Like it's about something very contemporary. It had the shifting perspectives really worked on me. I thought the Matt Damon performance was very funny. I thought the Ben Affleck performance was very funny. You know, like inverting those guys, kind of playing like who's playing the dumb guy and who's playing the smart guy. Was
Ben Affleck's hair.
Yes, Ben Affleck's haircut was hilarious. I thought the staging of some of the kind of action set pieces was great, and I love Jodie Comer, and I thought it was like a big meaty part for her to kind of rip into. There's like it's a courtroom drama at times, you know, there's like all these different pieces that really appeal to me. I don't know if I walked out thinking this is super commercial and it's going to be a big hit, but I did think it would resonate more. So I was a little surprised that it didn't resonate as much as it did, especially at a time when like a lot of frankly very mediocre movies were getting awards recognition in the 2020-2021 corridor. I think it's possible that House of Gucci coming out in the same year was held against it because House of Gucci landed with a bit of a thud. Yeah. And so it didn't get a chance to like clear the decks the way that it otherwise might have from an awards perspective. And then if a movie like that doesn't get awards, its legacy tends to dim more quickly. Like really has a lot of movies like this where you're like, oh, is a Good Year going to be a big deal this year? You know, is 1492 Conquest of Paradise going to be a big deal? Is G.I. Jane going to be a big deal? And then these movies just kind of come and go. And it felt like that's what happened to The Last Duel.
Yeah, it's too bad because it really is. I mean, it is something I would love to see on a big screen again, because I do remember it being a very cinematic experience, not just how they play with the structure, but like how Sean's saying with those battle sequences. I do think Jodie Comer was supposed to be cast in the Vanessa Kirby role in Napoleon, then had to drop out for a different movie. But I would have loved to see that switch. That would have been really interesting because she's so excellent. Vanessa Kirby's great too, but Jodie Comer, what she's up to in The Last Duel is one of the best performances of that year. And then also Vanessa Kirby doing what she can with that role in Napoleon. Sean, have you seen the Napoleon extended cut yet with the additional scenes?
No, I still haven't. I'm trying to carve out 3.5 hours since it's been proven difficult this fall.
Yeah, we started and then we were hoping to finish, but
so far tough. Yeah, so far like really love the theatrical cut, which is not something you say a lot about Ridley Scott. Usually he can do what he wants in those director cuts, those Ridley cuts.
Yeah, the only thing I was hoping for and I'm hoping for when we watch it is more Josephine, like because I think Ridley does, and maybe he hasn't talked about this as much in his filmography, but I think he does do something interesting with looking at like gender and power dynamics. It's not that he's making like feminist films necessarily or like women at the forefront, but he always is interested in the like power dynamics of his characters.
Yes.
And I really enjoyed Last Duel. And I think it was interesting how people responded to Napoleon, because I thought it was like pretty clear what he was doing with Josephine and Napoleon's dynamic there of her like being in this house for the rest of her life. And but I think that is something that I wonder in the extended cut if he'll just include more of as like the Josephine story.
It seems like that was what he did when we watched the first hour of it. It was just really hard. I mean, some of it seemed like a TV shoot, like for Apple Plus. The production started looking, the sets started looking very similar. But yeah, it's a long film. But going back to what you said about the woman of his movies, I do think that is not to give a director brownie points for being like, here's the secret woman lead of my movie, but that is kind of Ridley Scott's whole thing. His whole appeal is the Ripley character, who's the secret main character of his movie of Alien, which I do think is kind of a consistency across a lot of his movies, whether it be Blade Runner with Rachel or Prometheus or The Last Duel or Gladiator, obviously. There's just a lot of films where or Napoleon, like we were just talking about, there's a lot of films where either a woman is in the periphery, then she's in the forefront, and you realize the obstacles around her are much more severe than the men who are in power or who are leading the film, or it's a woman leading the movie, maybe something like a House of Gucci, and you're kind of watching her journey navigating all these kind of like insecurities and obstacles. And I think that has been really, successful. That's a successful through line, at least for characters for him, that I think has really worked. And also been an interesting way to, like, when I'm thinking about Spielberg or Scorsese or now Denis Villeneuve or Christopher Nolan, really does stand apart in actually finding screenplays where there are complex woman characters. Not that Scorsese being the most innocent of any director we've talked about today, because he has like some incredible epics, and like I'm thinking of Sharon Stone, for example, where like women are given a lot to do with very flawed characters. But it's just interesting to like see Christopher Nolan's filmography now, or Denis, even though he's had woman leads in his film more than Nolan has. They haven't really taken that part of the playbook, and maybe that's because Nolan does write a lot of his work, and then Denis does have such a handle over his screenplays as well, even though he doesn't write as much anymore. But yeah, that's an interesting observation. It's unfortunate that doesn't happen more.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, someone like Ripley being the kind of like sneak protagonist, like throughout the movie, it's kind of unfolding that, okay, she's going to be this like final girl figure.
Right.
But I do think that is something that is in his other work as well, where he does really have more complex woman characters, where, that's something that I feel like with Denis or Nolan, even though they have really commercial films, and I like most of Nolan's films. Sure. But I'm not maybe on like maybe I won't say I love every single one of them, but especially he's talked about all the time with having, not knowing really how to write women. And especially when we think of like Kitty Oppenheimer or something,
he's good at killing.
It's just that Kitty Oppenheimer would never be in a Ridley movie, so I think it is interesting.
I mean, I think it's something he's gonna have to interrogate. I mean, in his next few projects, I mean, apparently Matt Damon's gonna be starring in his next movie. Speaking of Damon, which is exciting. Nolan gonna be coming back about next year. Sean, I think you're now a Nolan head, right?
At times, I think the criticisms you're talking about are extremely valid. He just has a very singular male perspective, often in worlds that could stand to use a multiplicity of points of view. I think there's also just like anytime he works in genre, there's a kind of narrative threading that always gets lost for me.
Yeah.
It probably since like Memento is the last time where I was like, all right, you really got a handle on this. And everything since, and I love The Dark Knight, and I love Oppenheimer and Tenet and a handful of his other films. But I think that criticism is right on. And, part of it is just like Ridley Scott worked with Callie Curry on Thelma and Louise, that's just a perspective. Nicole Holofcener co-wrote The Last Duel. Like sometimes it's just as simple as having more female collaborators. Obviously Christopher Nolan's wife is his producing partner and somebody who's like a critical creative voice and a producing voice in his work. But for whatever reason, that's just not a strength of his. And, Villeneuve too, like I would not say that that's a strength, even though he's had a lot of female leads in his parts. I'm not sure that that's something he necessarily does as well as Ridley. I think also Ridley, the original conception of Ripley subverting our expectations, kind of wrong footing us through the hero of that movie was so novel at the time that it gets a kind of outsized credit for like what if science fiction but a woman, it's a little overstated. Like he's done it 5 times. He's made like 40 movies. He's not like the greatest crafter of stories about women in multi generations. But he has a handful of iconic characters, and that will get you over the line when we're having this kind of discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's good to put it in context. I mean, I think, I think you brought it up at the top, like he has his Ridley Grahams. He's a very visual storyteller. He doesn't like writing. He says he hates to read, and I believe him. But he, there's a really interesting story on the Gladiator behind the scenes that we were just watching recently, because we did an episode on that, where a woman producer came into the room while the screenwriters were just messing with the 20 pages of screenplay they had already 30 days into the shoot, because the production history of Gladiator is insane. It's wild that that's a coherent film. But one of the women producers walks into the room. I'm forgetting her name. But she overheard that they were going to kill Connie Nielsen's character. And she was like, you can't kill the only woman character in the movie. What are you guys, idiots? And all the men were looking around in the room being like, well, I guess it was good to have another perspective around. So yeah, absolutely. Sometimes it is just the fact that maybe he just didn't write his movies. And so you have other perspectives around there.
Yeah.
He also talks a lot about his mother and behind the scenes of being like, I do really want strong, complex women in my films. And I do want them kind of going head to head with them. And because I grew up with a woman who raised me while my dad was in the war, because that's how old Ridley Scott is.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, it's so funny to hear Ridley or just to see how he also plans all of his projects. Because I think in an interview, didn't he say he had like 8 pages or something of Gladiator 3?
Yes, he has 7 or 8 pages written.
Yeah, which is like
enough.
half the script.
That's half the movie. Yeah, he's ready to go. So we're excited for that. We'll get Denzel again. I think we can stop there about the Ridley conversation. I think we kind of figured out like if he had movies that were going to be timeless through the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, maybe the 2020s. What's so fascinating about him is that, like I said at the top, he's in the middle of like 3 or 4 productions right now.
Yeah.
And there's kind of no movie he hasn't made, even though I do think I identify him as one of the great epic filmmakers like of my lifetime. There really isn't a single genre I can pinpoint on him. My 3 favorite Ridley Scott movies, and I know this is like a hot take, but my 3 favorite are Alien, Blade Runner, and Prometheus. And the hot take being Prometheus being my number 3. And like obviously Thelma and Louise and The Last Duel and Gladiator are excellent films in their own right. And there's a whole bunch of other movies and the extended cuts of different films. Absolutely. But I do think he's the most exciting in space because it's just such a terrifying place, and I think that's where he thrives, or at least in dystopian worlds, right? Like Blade Runner 2. And so I hope he continues to make movies in those worlds, but apparently like he's in pre-production for a speed-like movie right now called Bomb, I believe. And he's going
I'm excited about that.
Me too. That sounds awesome. He's planning on making a biopic for the Bee Gees, which is interesting. And then I think he's got another epic planned, but I'm not sure what that is. And then there's another, undisclosed project he's working on, which I'm hoping is David, 3 or Alien Olympus. Sean, can you think of anything that you want to see as we kind of end our Ridley Scott conversation? Anything you want to see from this legendary director?
I mean, there's nothing that immediately springs to mind. He's pretty surprising in terms of the choices that he makes. Every time a new film is announced, I'm like, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting that, and so I'd like to maintain that spirit. The idea of Bomb is incredibly enticing. He's never really done like a pure, straight ahead contemporary action movie, right?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I don't think so. I can't think of.
I mean, the idea of him at 88 cranking out like a Jan de Bond movie is fascinating.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So that's very cool. I would be interested in that. I'm obviously on board for David 3 too. I think we all, the alien heads, want to see more of Fassbender in that role. It's going to be hard as Fassbender gets older. These androids are not supposed to age.
Right.
So he's going to need a lot of makeup there. And I know he's had a kid recently. That adds some wrinkles and some years to the face. Yeah, that's the hair.
That can't work.
He needs those beautiful blonde locks.
He's going to bring him back.
I would love to see him and Alicia Vikander, because I mean, she's played an AI character in
That's right.
Garland.
Ex Machina, wow.
Have them, instead of like Walter and David, just make it a family project.
Get Garland on the project, a Garland Scott
Who knew?
project.
Maybe it is an expanded universe. Maybe we can wend Ex Machina into the Weyland-Yutani universe. You can see maybe there was an acquisition of some kind from Oscar Isaac's corporation.
Yeah.
What was that company called? Like Blue Book or something?
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Amazon, Facebook. All right. So The Ringer, The Big Picture, Sean Fennessey, thank you so much for coming on. What do you guys got going on? I mean, our listeners for sure listen to The Big Picture, so like I can't even, it's not like you are an unknown person to the people who listen to our show. Your space in movies, or your voice in movies, has inspired our show, inspired us as lovers of film to talk about it, discuss it more. And what you've been doing on the show to bring on independent filmmakers and the Q&As that you do at the end of your episodes is so wonderful. I'm always appreciative of that, trying to find new conversations with new artists and new directors. I try to do that, on our show. We try to bring on different people, but really just because The Big Picture has created such a wonderful mold in the movie podcast space, which I know you're probably hating us celebrating you in this way. But what do you guys have coming up in the next few months? I know Amanda is going to be out, right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for saying that. It's very nice.
Yeah.
We're just trying to make a show, I think, that represents our passion for this stuff, just like you guys are. So I appreciate what you guys are doing too. Appreciate you having me here. What are we doing? I mean, it's a wide open Oscar season. So we're going to be talking about all the movies that are coming out, including Gladiator II. We'll talk about Blitz. We'll talk about Emilia Perez. We'll talk about Juror Number 2. We'll talk about Conclave. We'll talk about it's going to be an aura. It's going to be the brutalist. It's going to be a robust fall. So that's exciting. And then, we'll come up with some more gimmicks, just like we always do. Some more ways to have fun, some more dumb shit to do. And, I'm working on my solo potting with Amanda on leave. Hopefully she'll be back early in 2025. But, just thinking about looking right down the barrel of the camera, communicating directly with the audience in a hopefully non-creepy way. That's really where my focus lies these days. So thank you guys. Thanks for having me. And thanks for celebrating Ridley. So I feel comfortable doing this.